what to say. Alice Eldridge is a good friend of mine, but is a lecturer in music technology at the University of Sussex, where she is co-director of the Sussex Humanities Lab, a space where it is interdisciplinary research into the interactions between computation, technology, culture, society, and environment. With a background in cognitive science, artificial life, and computer science, Alice has been working at the interstices of music, technology, and ecology for 2 decades. She approaches soundscape research from a range of transdisciplinary perspectives, including computational methods for conservation and wilderness, mapping, synthetic modeling for theoretical and artistic purposes, live streaming for public engagement and restoration monitoring, and investigating human perception of soundscape to gain insight into environmental relations and values across culture. She is currently interested in the potential for integrating both dynamical system and indigenous perspective into ecoacoustic theoretical framework and analysis. The presentation, the title, N-Eared Listening, Transdisciplinary Ecoacoustics at Human-Environmental Interface. So I think that it's time for Alice to present your ideas in this session. You are welcome. You have 45 minutes, more or less, plus 5 minutes of discussion, but we have enough time.
Thank you very much, Elmo. First, I'd like to check, can you hear you can hear me okay? Can you hear also some sound?
Yes.
You can hear some birds. So I'm not going to share this, but this is a live stream of a nice rewilding site in Sussex. That's just my sound check.
The Bluetooth device is ready to pair.
And now you can see okay my screen, yeah?
Yes.
Excellent. So, buongiorno, grazie mille a tutti. It's a huge honor to be here. I very much feel like a disciple in this field. So it's a huge honor and slightly daunting to be giving one of the plenary talks here. As Alma mentioned, my background is quite mixed. I trained in cognitive science, in studying evolutionary adaptive systems, in computing, and I have a lifelong music practice. And in fact, I've ended up in the music department more for logistical reasons than anything else. I'm not an ecologist. I have had the privilege and honor of working with some brilliant conservation biologists. So please forgive me and importantly correct me if I make any ecological faux pas. I am an improviser as well by trade. So part of this talk was planned in advance, but it's also responded quite quickly to some of the ideas that were present and absent in yesterday's brilliant selection of talks. So it complements, I think, quite well Jerome's plea for a slow and aesthetical ecoacoustics. What I'm going to ask for is a breadth in our thinking, a breadth in our listening. So it's going to be, I hope you've all had your espressos if you're in Europe, and maybe you're still up from last night, I'm not sure, elsewhere in the world. It's going to be quite a whirlwind tour. I want to step back first of all and think about what we're doing and how and why. And then I'm going to illustrate some of the ideas, some of where this thinking has come from, through some of the work that we've done at the University of Sussex. I've had the privilege of working with a brilliant mix of ecologists, anthropologists, geographers, and programmers. This is a mix, as Almo mentioned in my biog, of synthetic simulation work, of experimental ecological field work, and increasingly of ethnographic work as well. This is not a comprehensive list, but some examples of the work that we're doing. And forgive me, I have been in the humanities for a few years now, so whilst I very much am dedicated to and enjoy doing science, in fact, I'm going to present really the kind of gaps between things today, if you like, to be more reflective about talking about some of the results that we don't publish in our scientific papers, some of the reflections, and how that might help us do better science and better science that makes a difference in the world in a better way, if you like. So first of all, to step back a minute, I think it's good in conferences to take this time we haven't got our normal coffee breaks, our dinners where we can discuss ideas. So this is a bit hand wavy. This is very new. Some of these ideas literally came to me yesterday during the talks. So please, I hope that's okay. We've all recognised and celebrated the fact that ecoacoustics is a new and rapidly growing science. This is not a systematic review, but Almo, amongst others, have noted in the past that actually the majority, the strongest research effort, if you like, has been in ecoacoustics, in this development of new methods and new tools and their application. Yeah, so as a discipline, we've been really iterating around. I don't know if you can see my mouse. No, I don't think we can. We've been iterating around this bottom left hand corner. We've been making new methods, new tools, new hardware, new software for environmental monitoring primarily. We haven't really been iterating around this bigger cycle of the scientific process, if you like. If I understand correctly, I'm excited to be sharing this conference with Bernie Krause, who's a huge inspiration to me as a student, and I'll talk about that later. If I understand correctly, our major founding theory, the acoustic niche hypothesis, came in part, or if not in full, from Bernie's experience of deep immersion, of listening in the world. Yeah, so we've had this sort of initial observation and theory building, and then all the research we've been doing has been around developing new tools so we can make future observations, right? But we haven't really been looping back around this loop, and this is for good reason, right? That obviously climate change, biodiversity loss are very, very pressing problems, and as with lots of microscopic or macroscopic science, we need new tools to augment our perception in time and space to be able to witness and evidence the phenomena of interest, right? So we've been focusing particularly on community, population, landscape level soundscape analyses over long periods, as Jerome talked about. And for this, we need new methods for spatial and temporal scalability. But the problem with that, the kind of, it's a double-edged sword, right? As with lots of omics, so big data disciplines, genomics, astrophysics, etc., the increasing automation, the rise of deep learning, as came up yesterday, deep learning is notoriously opaque. So whilst it gives us the power to look at things at scale, it makes theoretical development kind of harder. We come to this kind of epistemic impasse, if you like, where deep learning in ecoacoustics particularly is fantastic for presence absence, for anomaly detection, but as has been highlighted elsewhere, we're kind of drowning in data. We're both lacking theory to properly interpret our results, and we're also lacking the first-hand experience needed to develop new theory. So a reminder, this could do with a diagram, but a reminder that soundscape is operating at least two scales, right? We've got this kind of global soundscape, the landscape population community level, but as I've talked about with Almo a lot, and we've recently published, we actually, soundscape is primarily subjective. It's primarily a semiotic experience, right? Sound by definition is the experience of vibration. So sound is interpreted, soundscape is interpreted via our ears, our nervous system, by a living agent. And so what we're missing in all of this is experience, right? And I'm going to come back to that later on. So quite a bold, kind of zoomed out thinking about how we're doing science. what we've been focusing on, what we're missing, and also thinking about application, right? So our focus to date, necessarily because of the urgency of it, has been on environmental monitoring, but I think it's useful to think why we're doing that monitoring, because it needs to feed into decision making, and ultimately that's about environmental and social sustainability. Yeah, and one of the things I want to point to in this talk is that the knowledge that we're using to generate these decisions must be inclusive and equitable of all the people and processes, in fact, that are living in those landscapes. So through the research I'm going to talk about in these case studies, I've come to realize the importance of stakeholders, of local communities, of the investment of local communities and their contribution, not only practically and ethically, but also epistemically, also the value of knowledge. Many speakers in this conference have noted, especially from colonized countries, have become to acknowledge Indigenous or First Nations. But what I'd like to suggest in this talk is where communities are willing and interested, that we engage in equitable partnerships with local communities, and that this can actually be a fantastic and valuable way to not only bolster better science, but importantly, make better decisions. Okay, so I'm going to go through 6 case studies. Some of them I will skip over some of the scientific details. I will go into some detail, but I want to talk more about the other questions that have arisen. And through this work, want to draw a picture. That's the wrong, let's not use visual analogies. Want to generate a sense of soundscape as an interface, as we've talked about, a semiotic interface between species, between vibrational and vibrasensile creatures, but also between disciplines and between epistemologies, that this is ethically necessary, also leads to better science and better decision making, and hopefully a better world. So these case studies explore synthetic, experimental and experiential perspectives. And I'm going to start off with simulation studies. So this is more like a little trailer. Haven't got time to go deeply into these, but all the references are there. All the work is open access. If you can't access something you'd like to, just drop me an email. I've noted that there haven't been that many simulation studies in ecoacoustics to date, and this is actually quite a valuable tool for method development. So this is also by way of a kind of historical survey, if you like. This was my first foray into the world. As a student in 2001, I was studying evolutionary adaptive systems at the University of Sussex, and that's when I first read Bernie Krause's paper, his 1993 acoustic niche hypothesis paper. And this really blew my mind. As a student of evolution, I was also a musician, and we hadn't really thought about sound in the evolutionary ecosphere, right? That hadn't come up in anything I'd read before. And so as a good student of artificial life, I set about trying to make an evolutionary agent-based model to explore the acoustic niche hypothesis. So this is a really simplified model, bit like those used in individual-based ecology, Epstein and people from the 90s. It's a simple symbolic implementation of the acoustic niche hypothesis. So on the left is a representation of the initial random population. Yeah, so each agent is specified by a pitch and a time slot, and at each time step it vocalizes, and there's a simple energy rule which says if you can hear another agent but it's not too overcrowded, a bit like a cellular automata, then you can reproduce. Yeah, and through that simple rule, the image on the right is some number of iterations later, we see this we see some clustering. So that was published in my thesis, actually work done in about 2002. after some time working in the field, in the kind of muddy ecology, I came back to this work and have published a more sophisticated version recently. And as I say, I note this just because we haven't explored this much in ecoacoustics. This work I've published within the Artificial Life press, and it has spawned some interest in that field. There's been a few people picking this up and developing it. So this work I note here, this is an updated version that was trying to establish the minimal conditions for the emergence of spectrotemporal partitioning through low-level agent-environment interactions. In this version, they're acoustically, they're what we call sonically situated. So each agent is specified by a frequency, a phase, and a phase which determines both its vocalizing and listening behaviors. So I'm not going to go deeply into this work. It's really just a kind of flag to say, just to a placeholder to say, hey, we've got paucity of theory in ecoacoustics. Maybe we should think about the value of simulation studies. So I'm going to move on then from that to some field work. This was my first foray into the world of ecological research. This was work done back in 2014. It actually arose from a conversation at the ZSL conference in 2012 on remote sensing, where I was new to ecology, and I couldn't believe that the standard approach was to put your wellies on and go and count things in the field. As an informatic, I worked in music informatics at that time, and it seemed obvious to me that we should be able to do machine listening in microprocessors, and that would be a fantastic solution. And I was completely naive, imagining then, this felt like a dream then, to be able to have these kind of networks of devices monitoring and sending data up into the cloud. Now, of course, that's a reality, but perhaps we still need some better methods. So this was a research project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, looking to validate acoustic indices. Now, we've talked a lot about these yesterday. I'm going to go through this quite quickly, but obviously happy to ask any questions. I was going to skip over the scientific details of this completely, but actually some of the things that came up yesterday were things we thought about quite deeply in this project. So I'll go through this, spend a few minutes going through this. So at this point, when we wrote the grant, at least, no one had really validated acoustic indices across different habitats. And importantly as well, again, I came from music information retrieval, where it was really common practice, of course, to have a compound index, a set of features, rather than relying on one feature. And that wasn't something that was being investigated much at that time. So our research questions were then whether AIs track and predict avian diversity, whether compound indices are more powerful than any single indices, and particularly then thinking about the difference between temperate and tropical situations, where obviously we've got vastly different acoustic communities. How does the presence of other species impact that? And how do simple acoustic descriptors, so things like RMS, zero crossing rate, these very, very cheap descriptors, how do they compare to the AIs that were developed, the acoustic indices that were developed in ecoacoustics? Standard design considerations. Then, to look at this, we needed an ecological gradient across habitat structure, across heterogeneity of soundscape, including biotic and abiotic sources. We needed to have decent spatial temporal replication, and we wanted to compare, as I say, between individual and compound indices. As everybody here knows, this is a mixture of very muddy data collection. This was actually in a method that this photo is the chief of a Warani community, where we did our methodological pilot in the Western Amazon, so in East Ecuador. So very muddy field work, and then equally muddy multivariate stats. This is Nenke, the chief of Nenkapare. In fact, we did our that was a pilot study. We did our final research, in fact, in the Western Ecuador, in the Choco region. So this is a representation of the study sites. We were comparing temperate and tropical across a gradient of habitats. So in each place, a primary or ancient forest, at the other extreme, an agricultural or monocultural site, and in between a regenerating or secondary forest. Just to give you some visual representations, here's the ancient woodland, Plashet Wood in Sussex in the UK. Knepp Estate, which is now quite famous, a 3,000 hectare rewilding project, what was an arable farm in West Sussex, which has been regenerating now for 5 years. So kind of a mosaic, a patchwork of woodland, hedgerow and open scrubland, field becoming scrub. And a monoculture, a barley farm on the South Downs. And similarly in Ecuador, the primary ancient forest of Tercero Escondido, which is now a reserve for the brown-headed spider monkeys. That's in the Choco region, so the bit of it's the Amazon rainforest split by the Andes on the west coast, comes down from Colombia. Secondary was in Puerto Quito, regenerating what had been a fruit chopped forest cleared for fruit, which again had been regenerating for a similar amount of time, and an oil palm plantation, another monoculture. Our sampling protocol mixed some ideas. This was before the fantastic methods paper that Raffles Lawrence et al. Published in 2019. So we were sampling in 2 ecozones, temperate and tropical, in 3 habitats, primary, regenerating, agricultural. We had a matrix of 15 recorders in each. I was convinced by Almo's idea of near field at that time. So we had these quite close together, 200 to 250 meters on a low gain. And we recorded for 2 weeks in each habitat, 1 minute in 15, but also these full dawn choruses, dawn and dusk, and the midday chorus in the Amazon. Of these 2-week recordings, we selected a 3-day subset, labeling, which were then labeled with species ID, abundance, and also a kind of subjective biophonic density, which also labeled, so labeled overall density of the chorus, also things like rain and wind. So that gave us around 1,200 1-minute files from Ecuador, and 1,900 about 1,900 in the UK. So we looked at a wide gamut of acoustic indices, all the common ones at the time: ACI, Acoustic Diversity Index, Bioacoustic Index, Spectral Temporal Entropy, NDSI. And then we also looked at some simple acoustic descriptors, so RMS, spectral centroid, and zero crossing rate. We looked as well at the mean, variance, median, minimum, maximum of ACI, RMS, spectral centroid, and zero crossing, because the rate of change in some of these descriptors also intuitively could be useful indicators. That gave us 26 values per 1-minute sound file across the whole data set, both the labeled subset and the whole data set, which was about 80,000 1-minute files. So just to quickly look through the results, because this is part of the bigger story I want to tell about the way we do science and how we know. So sharing with you the first things we all do, some exploratory data analysis, a PCA on the bird species data, also including some noisy mammals, and we get this first look that there's some structure in the data. So the red is the primary forest, and here we can see presence of howler monkeys, which are unique to that habitat. The green is the secondary forests. There's roosters and dogs. And I have to say, I'm not an expert in the birds of this region. Possibly only one person is. And the oil palm plantations, quite well separated. And the acoustic indices give us similar. So this is a PCA of the main indices. Give a similar. There's some overlap, but we can definitely see some structure in the data. And similarly, in the UK, we see the blue is the barley farm, and there we can see that's uniquely contains sheep, the sheep surrounding the farm on the downs, some corn bunting, skylarks. The red and the green is quite intermixed. We haven't got that much separation between the primary and the regenerating, and that's perhaps not surprising given that NEP is this matrix of woodland and farmland. But we can see coming up the top, we can see this unique green streak, which is the nightingale, for example, is unique to NEP. And we saw a similar result in the structure of the acoustic indices, the farm being more distinct and the other environments being more mixed. And just to give a quick sense of the sound of that, we can hear the primary forest. And it's interesting to think about these. We were talking yesterday about the distance, the receptive distance of mics. You can really hear the reverberation of the woodland in these recordings. What surprised me at first, if we listen to the NEP recording, can you hear okay? I hope so. It's actually quite brutal, the dawn chorus. It's much, but many more birds present. This goes against that first sort of instinct of more ancient habitat being higher in biodiversity. But of course, it makes perfect sense because this is a mixed habitat. So we've got both farmland and woodland birds. And then moving on to the farm, it's almost silent. Some skylarks, the odd corn bunting, but it's essentially a silent landscape. Now, of course, Ecuador is a much noisier place, a much wider range of taxa making noises. So to come to our research questions, then we're interested in whether the acoustic indices tracked observed differences in avian diversity. All our data was calculated using species richness per recorder initially. Yeah, so we're interested in looking at variation across time and then across communities in each habitat. So the first question is do the acoustic indices correlate with the observed species richness? And then, as I mentioned, how did the presence of different species impact these relationships? And how well do these simple descriptors compare to the bespoke acoustic indices? So that's maybe a slightly overwhelming figure. On the left, we've got species richness. Top is UK, bottom is Ecuador. The stars denote p-values, and at the top of that scale is 80%. So I was actually quite surprised by how strong some of these correlations were. We've got up to 65% for acoustic diversity index, bioacoustic, acoustic evenness. We're all above 60%. Interestingly, the cheaper, simpler features, so RMS, spectral centroid, zero crossing, that's blue, green, and black. Some of those are over 50% still, which for very, very simple indices quite surprised me. Bottom left, we have species richness, that's avian species richness in Ecuador. So not surprisingly, we get very low results because there's so many other vocalizing taxa, right? And that was the idea of these slightly crude subjective ordinal measures of biophonic density was as we can see on the right, we get much more similar patterns between the UK and Ecuador, suggesting that the indices are not bad at tracking human subjective assessments of biophonic density, but we need to be cautious about exploring just relationships with one particular taxa. In places like Ecuador, as across the tropics, of course, it's impossible to identify invertebrates, for example. So we need these kind of subjective measures. Okay, so the next question then was do AIs track diurnal variation? So a quick sanity check, just to look at the variation. This is acoustic complexity index, acoustic evenness. You can see on the left-hand side the indices. This was done on a full data set, so about 28,000 1-minute files per habitat across all 10 days. So quite noisy, but we can see some really distinct patterns as we would expect. So in these indices which respond to an increase in biophonic density, we can see at the top there acoustic index, acoustic complexity, acoustic evenness, biophonic, biodiversity index. We see silent nights and the clear dawn choruses in the UK. And in Ecuador, we see some of these reverse patterns. So for example, in the secondary, it's very clear the acoustic evenness in the center column in the secondary is quite quiet during the day, and then these sudden nocturnal choruses. So we see these anuran choruses at dusk. So that more of a sanity check to see that with the types of patterns that we're getting are expected. One of the key questions that I was interested here was then, can these indices, and particular compound indices, capture observed differences in the community composition between habitats? So doing multivariate classification using random forests, here are some confusion matrices of the results. On the left-hand side, we have the species data, and on the right-hand side, we have the acoustic indices for the UK at the top and Ecuador at the bottom. Now, this I found quite striking. That so just to be clear, in columns are the actual habitats, and in the rows are the predicted. Okay, and so the stronger the black diagonal, the better the model. And if we look at the acoustic indices for Ecuador, that's really impressive. We have very low error rates. And what's interesting is that actually the acoustic indices better predict habitat than the bird species. So that's quite an interesting result, very promising. Not surprising, given we're omitting the invertebrates and anurans, but even so, it was very convincing to me that there's something going on here, right? That the acoustic community, that the soundscape is definitely a strong predictor of the habitat, possibly better than the traditional ways of using bird inventories, as had been done previously by colleagues in that area. And just a quick look, because this came up yesterday, so looking at the value of compound indices, so with a multivariate random forests, you can look at which variables best split the data. So minimal depth indicates essentially the importance of each variable in clustering. And there's some interesting differences. So the bioacoustic index was strongest in both. But in the left, it gives you the cumulative percentage variance explained. In Ecuador, actually, there's just zero crossing. Some of the simple zero crossing measures were really powerful. And I wondered whether this is because of the invertebrate choruses, that the noisiness of those is quite well detected by these simple measures. Okay, so the conclusions that we published in the paper was that AIs indeed predict or correlate with avian species richness, especially in temperate environments. There are weaker relationships in multi-taxa tropical environments, that these simple acoustic features are pretty valuable. And if we think about doing embedded computing, that's really useful, right? Because simple computationally is low energetic cost. And that, of course, these compound indices were more powerful predictors than any single index. But some of the other thoughts, and perhaps the most important thoughts really, are that these indices are kind of deaf to the dynamic, the semiotic nature of soundscapes. There's definitely useful information in the acoustic environment, but perhaps it's not being picked up by these indices. So I wrote another paper at the time looking at potential applications of PLCA, of source separation. And I'm thinking at the moment about acoustic early warning signals, so thinking about dynamical systems approaches. But what I want to focus on today for the rest of this time is thinking that actually one of the things was that the theory of acoustic niche hypothesis is a great story. The data, the statistics are quite convincing, but I felt a bit dissatisfied, because I thought, well, if Bernie's come across this idea by listening, he spent hundreds of hours, maybe thousands. But what about these communities? We're working with Waorani communities, these shamanic communities, these forest societies, these people living so closely in interaction with nature. If this is really a phenomenon, if we can hear the sound, the status of the forest, where are the traces of this in the practices, the cultures, the everyday lives, if you like, of these people? So that's not to say it didn't exist. We were working with Waorani communities. We had shared really bad Spanish, but I didn't have enough time to kind of dig deep and understand. So I want to move on, then jump a few years forward, and I was working, in fact, with another methodological pilot, this time in Indonesia, in a reef restoration project. This is a project, again, I was working with a colleague, Mika Peck, working with a community who are doing some brilliant work in using artificial structures for reef restoration. There's a real problem there with cyanide fishing and for the illegal aquarium trade. And they're trying to combat that by setting up an aquarium for supplying that trade rather than fishing them. But what would be really fantastic is if they could have their own sets of tools for monitoring and evidencing the reef, because that would enable financial resources and give the fishers an extra income. So the aim of this work is to develop low cost and accessible technologies for evidencing reef restoration. The results of that research have been published, and the headline is there is a positive relationship between live coral cover and fish abundance, and that relationship is also we can see a positive relationship with acoustic evenness index in particular. Apologies if this is frustrating, but I actually want to skip over the science and actually talk about a conversation I had instead during a rainy tea break where we couldn't go out diving, with a marine biologist from the local area. While we've been in Ecuador in the Amazon, as I say, I wanted to hear what the local people thought. I wanted to hear what the Waorani communities thought about the possibility of listening to ecosystems. But we didn't have a strong enough communication to really explore that. And sitting with this fisherman from Sulawesi, who was also a brilliant marine biologist, I said to him, "What do you think then? We're going out, we're doing these acoustic surveys. Is this a good idea? Can we listen to the health of the reef? What do you think?" And he just looked at me as if I was a bit mad and said, "Yeah, of course you can. When we go fishing at night, most of the night fishing is common. We don't know where the reef is. We put our oar to our ear, and then we can hear the crackle like raining. Then we know where the reef is, and then we know where the fish is." Okay, so that really pleased me because that felt like a kind of strong triangulation of theory, of our statistical data, and this traditional knowledge, this everyday practice that they know where the fish is, because the snapping shrimps that make the sound live on the reefs where the fish also live. Okay, maybe it's because I was trained in psychology initially, and there's been a huge kickback and an issue in lack of reproducibility. I've become slightly skeptical of not of the scientific method, but of the fact that we can almost find any patterns that we want in data at times. So this triangulation of data, of theory, and of everyday experience felt really reassuring and feels like a really important and valuable approach. Okay, so I've got about 10 minutes left. I want to speak of two other case studies quickly, and then hand wave at some possible future directions. So now we're starting to talk here about a kind of soundscape. There's this sort of epistemic nexus, at this place of like coming together of different knowledges, of different ways to know the world. And that's something that we're exploring explicitly in some work on wilderness mapping. This is some ongoing work, working primarily with two colleagues, John Carruthers-Jones and Roger Norham. This is a kind of applied ecoacoustics, if you like, but an applied broader ecoacoustics, which brings in ethnographic as well as geophysical perspectives. So the context here is conservation of wilderness, recognition of the critical importance of wilderness for the planet. But of course, there's a challenge, there's a conflict between the needs of conservation and of development, and that's a global challenge. We recognize that all conservation planning and policy must be evidence-based, and that's what's driving an awful lot of ecoacoustic work. But and we need to represent human as well as non-human species, as well as the other biotic and abiotic processes which arguably define wilderness. Current wilderness maps are based purely on geophysical features, so things like distance from the road, absence of human, and are literally blind and deaf to these other human, non-human and biotic, abiotic processes. So what we've been developing is a participatory project which integrates human experiences of landscape with means to proxies for ecological status and geophysical features within this kind of, to create a kind of multi-sensory cartography, if you like. So as mentioned, this is a multidisciplinary team working with environmental geographer, that's John Carruthers-Jones on the left, and Roger Norham overseeing me installing a sound recorder. We've been carrying out this work in various wilderness mountain landscapes. This iteration was in Abisko in Swedish Lapland. And as I said, this is a mix of participatory walking, ecoacoustics, biodiversity surveys, and GIS data. So the challenge is kind of integrating these top-down methods with the bottom-up. We need new methods to create maps for decision-making which integrate the empirical data with subjective human knowledge, with perceptions and values, as well as the biotic and abiotic processes. And what we're proposing is that actually listening, the soundscape is a useful kind of point to bring these together. So I'm going to skip just a quick slideshow to give you this sort of idea. We essentially take stakeholders on walks through the landscape, we collect habitat data, we do ecoacoustic surveys, and we do interviews along the way at different points of wilderness as defined by current measures. And the idea then here is to integrate the GIS, the vegetation data, the image layers from remote satellite surveys with ecological data, habitat data, range and cover of species, acoustic recordings, and ethnographic interviews, questionnaires, qualitative data. So we've seen already that human perception does correlate with some of the acoustic indices. But actually, again, the reflections not published in the paper, we need to rethink our indices in these contexts. You know, the places like the Arctic are definitely wildernesses, are definitely pristine habitats, but they are low in biophonic density. Perhaps the acoustic niche hypothesis is not so meaningful in these landscapes. As I say, there's not a high biophonic density. There's not pressure from other species. Geophony and wind in particular is a really powerful force, both atmospherically and perhaps in evolutionary terms. I noted that Almo's been thinking about this recently. Certainly, I'm not an ornithologist, but I certainly noted whilst trekking in the area, extremely strong winds, north-south valleys. You suddenly understand why the calls of some of these Arctic birds are so piercing, so focused, such pure tones that penetrate this blustering wind. So there's some interesting questions there. And really then what I'm thinking about at the moment is the value of soundscape as this rich kind of epistemic interface between and beyond academic disciplines. So there's some challenges. How do we represent the inherently subjective nature of soundscape as a semiotic vehicle in a scalable way? How do we represent the ecosystems of the wilderness? How do we create proxies for them? And how do we integrate that with GIS data? So we don't have the answers yet. We're developing a conceptual framework, and this is a representation of the kind of methods, the interactions between local actors and policymakers, and this desire to kind of integrate the top-down geophysical, the macro level, with the ecological processes, the experience, and even then the memory and the vision. So that's the challenge. How do we do that? We're thinking about that at the moment. We're currently setting up a long-term survey in the French Pyrenees, the acoustic survey, to try and develop the methods, that side of the methods. For the other work, we need significant funding. Okay, I have a few minutes left. One last thing I want to point to, the last case study I want to point to, is a live pilot taking place in the Quechua communities of Ecuador. So this is the Pax community, the ancestral Quechua population of Corsac Sacha in eastern Ecuador. This is 5 Quechua communities that live here in this region. We're working with, it is an indigenous-led project, working with NGO Sachuami, who seek to revitalize traditional indigenous knowledge, and in order to safeguard their future, both culturally and of their habitat. And this is one of the key issues we're coming up against. These communities seek heritage status, they seek protection, but currently things like UNESCO, either you apply for heritage, for your cultural heritage, or you apply for ecological conservation status. But that division makes no sense, right? In shamanic cultures, the forest is of ecocultural value. And so what we're helping them to do is to articulate, they recognize, so for me, coming from working with the Warani communities, all these for over a decade, thinking, where is the traces, where are the discussions, where are the myths, the stories, the everyday practices of celebrating the soundscape, or engaging with the soundscape, if you like, as a proxy for ecosystem status. So this is what we're exploring as a science. Where is that living out, yeah, in these cultures, in these forest societies? So this project came about through a series of coincidences, but sure enough, in the Pax community, they talk about things like a healthy forest is one that sings. Yeah, this idea of the soundscape is this interface not only between the organisms in the forest and the human communities, but the way they talk about it also is it's an interface with the their ancestors. So Didier Lecatse, who works for Sachuami, he describes their perspectives of the soundscape like this. He says, we use the songs to communicate with the jungle and its guardian spirits, to call the animals of the forests or the fish of the river, to invoke or promote the fertility of the crops, to cure evils and disease, remembering and transmitting teachings left by our ancestors to live well together. So that's notion of buen vivir is across Ecuador. They are like roads, the soundscapes, they are like roads and bridges that reconnect us with our history and with our origins. The living beings of the jungle also have their own way of expressing the life that manifests through them. The set of the songs heard is like a symphony, which took millions of years to write. It's a unique and priceless creation, which we cannot let be destroyed or disappear. So this I found this extraordinary to read these words, which almost exactly mimic writings of people like Bernie Krause. You know, these have come through experience, and our role here is to help these communities to protect the forest to try to articulate these in ways that can align with the bureaucracies of firstly Ecuadorian and later national heritage. But it also then questions our conservation imperatives. Maybe we can talk about that later on. So I need to note then that this work is being done during this year. So it's absolutely not being done by me. It's being led by Paula Moscoso, who's in the front of the boat there. She's an ex-PhD student who's an Ecuadorian national. Rosala Canelos in the red hat is a Quechua communicator, and her partner Didier Lecadze, who's been living in Ecuador and South America for about 30 years. Together they lead Sachuami. And we're working with them in a kind of form of co-production to try to integrate traditional indigenous knowledge with ethnographic methods such as sound mapping and sound walks, with ecoacoustics, recording and listening, as well as more creative methods around illustration and filmmaking to try and articulate the cultural, spiritual, ecological value of soundscapes for them, for very applied conservation. So we're helping them apply for heritage status, and also for cultural heritage. In fact, since working with them, I've realized that they're not interested. They actually don't want this to come back into academic research. They're a bit fed up with academics. So I'm running out of time. I'm just going to then sum up by trying to explain what I mean by this triangulation, by this methodological triangulation. What do I mean by N-eared listening? Well, it provides on a term coined by one of the elders from a First Nation Canadian. This two-eyed seeing is a guiding principle of integrative science, which is increasingly shown to be of huge value in environmental management, especially in fisheries. And it's trying to integrate, if you like, the strengths of indigenous knowledges with those of mainstream knowledges, with different ways of knowing. So and central to this idea is the notion that this knowledge transforms and gives responsibility to act. So to describe what N-eared listening might be, we recognize that ecoacoustics needs new theories, we need new methods. How might we build practices across academic disciplines, integrating modeling, ecological science, data science, ethnography, creative practice with traditional knowledge systems? Might new observations inspire new science questions, new perspectives, new analyses, new imperatives for conservation? And what kind of methodological triangulations might be productive, both in advancing our desire to understand the role of sound in ecosystems and also in better managing? So I've mentioned this idea of integrating experience into theory and data is not simply something I've dreamed up. It's core to disciplines like neuroscience, which is similarly finding patterns in high dimensional dynamic data. They're currently turning to experience in methods such as microphenomenology. We might think about, I'm exploring the interactions between ecoacoustics, anthropology, geography. We might think about ecological theory, AI and ethnography, kind of participatory design of new methods. Jerome mentioned musicology, psychoacoustics, ecology. We might think about semiotics, simulation, and data. So, sorry, I've gone a little bit over time, but I hope that makes some sense, and that this kind of a plea, if you like, to broaden out our ways of thinking, our ways of listening, and to integrate those in ways that advance our science and our management of the planet. So a huge number of acknowledgements of all the people that I've worked with. Any questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Alice, for this fantastic presentation. And we have time for opening discussion. Before, I have to read two comments from attendees. Laila Fan, thank you, Alice. I love your presentation, especially involved indigenous perspective which relate to the local culture, listening, knowledge, and sensory experience. I am interested about how do you see the human listening and the human listening, how these parts could be integrated or applied in the field of ecoacoustic research in the future. This is a question also. The second, V.I. Ramesh, thank you for this wonderful plenary alerts. In the beginning of your talk, you highlighted this cycle of theory, informing hypothesis, and so on. You also spoke about advancement in methods and technology that have been used in the field of ecoacoustics today. Do you feel that as a community, we are being driven more by our tools and methods rather than focusing on advancing the theory and science of our field? These are more or less two comments and two questions. Can you spend some word in this?
Yes, so thank you very much for your positive and kind words. So to speak to Lila's, how do we see the human and how do we hear human listening and non-human listening, maybe better than seeing? Well, I mean, how do we can't possibly, right? That's been talked about at length. We can't know what it's like to be a bat, can we? So I mean, it's something that we've talked about a lot. Many people have considered, do we need to rethink? In the simplest case, we've talked about, you know, our acoustic indices, our computational methods are tuned primarily to the human range of hearing. Part of that is, so that's very simply just the range. Part of that is logistical, right? We can't go up into ultrasound. It becomes very heavy in data terms. There's really simple things that I've thought about, which I would love if anyone here, maybe there's some bioacousticians, I'd love to talk about things like now in deep learning, we tend to feed in a MEL spectrum representation, a MEL scaled, that comes from music, which is scaling the spectrum according to the way that we hear, right? So it's giving greater weight to low frequencies. I'm not even sure, is all organisms hearing logarithmic? Possibly. Is it a feature of biological all listening organisms, all listening organs? That's an important question I don't know the answer to. Similarly, you know, we've talked about this is complex because it's also, listening is also about our semiotic sensitivities, what things mean to us, you know, what we need as an organism. This relates to Almo's ecofield hypotheses. So it's a hugely interesting, philosophically, theoretically and practically a really important question. How can we possibly, if you know, the front line is if that's computational methods, how can we possibly make computational methods that take into account other organisms' perspectives? That's one side. And then the other side is the kind of ethical side, if you like. You know, how can we begin to think? And that's a step we can take straight away. How can we begin to try to think, to imagine how things might be from another organism's perspectives? And that's something that we can all do straight away. I'm not sure if that completely answers the question. We could spend a whole life answering that question. So thank you, Leila. Really interesting. Vijay, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Do you feel as a community we're being driven more by our tools and methods than, well, this is something that Almo, you know, not only Almo, but Almo certainly has talked about a lot. Yes, you know, and I've mentioned in papers before, I think there is a recognition that it's partly because of the urgency. You know, there's such urgent questions in our field for tracking, monitoring biodiversity, monitoring climate change, monitoring restoration, that of course we're driven by our methods, by our tools and our methods, because we need our tools to be able to observe, right? And that's sort of what I was trying to explain in these ideas. I haven't written these ideas up yet, but I think that there is this kind of what I called an epistemic impasse. We need the tools to be able to make the observations, but without the theory, we can't interpret the data that comes from the tools, right? So yeah, we need to find ways to kind of move forward there. So yes, the answer to Vijay. Thank you.
Okay, it's fine. There are other questions from the panelists, because with time we are a little in delay.
Yeah, so maybe we should leave. We don't want to run in.
Jenny? No. Okay.
So
Well,
Klaus has put in a question. Thank you, Klaus, for that. I'll just quickly speak to Yen Lu's question. Did Indigenous people feel the soundscape complexity has changed in the long term? I'm not sure yet, Yen Lu. We haven't got that far. That's one of the things, that's sort of one of the points. If we talk about how we might implement these ideas, it strikes me that the Amazon is an amazing place to explore, precisely because we now realize that the Amazon, the biodiversity has come through management, right? So these communities are used to have actively increased biodiversity. So if we're looking at ways to monitor restoration, these communities have been doing it for 10,000 years. So probably we should speak to them. Thank you.
Okay, I think that this topic is so interesting that we should maintain open the discussion for all. Whether is not possible. I'm really sorry. We will discuss a longer session about this point. So now, thank you very much again for your fantastic presentation, and I open for the next session.